raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages audio journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub, diving deep into the well springs of science and discovery as we go in search of answers to the ancient past. And as always here, right around the holidays, my cohorts and comrades, the Seven Ages Research Associates, Jason Pintrail and James Waldo, join me here in our favorite little locale this side of space and time. How you fellas doing?
Well, Micah, when I'm in this little locale, in this part of space and time, I never had it so good.
Never had it so good? Well, no time like the holidays to have so much. And again, when you surround yourself with wonderful company, you have everything that you need. Right, Jason?
We have everything we need. 4 months worth of renovation on the house done, and I'm sitting here snugly in the Crosstime Pub with a little Christmas spirit of Glenlivet here.
Oh, I thought you had a little eggnog.
Well, minus nog. I just went straight for the Glenlivet tonight.
Okay.
Yeah, that's Scottish eggnog, man.
Yeah, Scottish eggnog. Yeah, I'm familiar with that. You know, some folks out there maybe do have a little more, though, than they need, even here around the holidays. Maybe you heard the one about the gentleman in France who was recently questioned by authorities on account of the fact that he had a few archaeological relics lying around. And by a few, I mean he had 27,400 artifacts, including 14,000 Roman coins. Now, you boys know my affinity for numismatism, but this guy took it to an all-new level. According to CNN, in September 2019, the French National said he discovered 14,154 coins on land that he owns, but not in France, in Belgium. Problem is, he probably didn't actually find it there. Belgian authorities questioned the man and contacted their French counterparts, according to a press release from French customs authorities that was published just today, as of the time that we are recording this. But here's the issue. If he found these in France, or anything actually in his collection, that's a problem inherently, because any archaeological objects that are found in France are the property of the state. So he's not allowed to keep all these things, and he had 27,400 objects lying around, and maybe not a story that completely checked out about where he got them.
Yeah, well, that makes sense, and you know, it happens more often than you would think. But we don't really hear European stories about that as often, and that's really fascinating. Did it happen to say, what the outcome was, or is it still under investigation?
I think that it's still under investigation, although, again, they note that the Roman coins that were in his possession are of exceptional quality, wherever he actually found them. I'll tell you what else is turning up even more frequently than Roman coins all over the place, and that's these weird monoliths. Are you guys following the story about all these monoliths and their appearances everywhere?
Yeah, that's pretty entertaining. I thought surely these things were like a movie prop or some kind of a pre-viral marketing for some upcoming project.
Right. Well, we may have to check in with the prehistory guys, because the latest appearance of one of these monoliths was right there on the Isle of Wight off England's south coast. I never was able to make it down there when I was in England. But the thing that struck me about the fact that one of these monoliths has shown up there in England is the fact that we're seeing them all over the place. I mean, it's kind of like this viral art movement. I've heard people refer to it as a lot of different things, but for me, it's interesting, this human propensity to want to, erect these totems or these structures. Think about the dolmens. Think about the menhirs that we see, again, throughout the British Isles, all the way down into France and places like that, the so-called standing stones of Brittany, if you've heard of those. This seems to be something that humans have done for a long time, and for my own part, even with the sci-fi references or the viral art, call it what you will, but I think that the modern monolith phenomenon that we've seen over the last few weeks is almost this sort of continuation of the things that we see at places like Stonehenge.
Well, having actually had the opportunity to go to Stonehenge myself, and Avebury for that matter, those stones tell, they stand the test of time. It's very impressive. But as far as these monoliths go, it's one of those copycat type things, where you got one and then they stop popping up all over the other places. And we've seen them in Europe. We've seen them in Asia popping up all over. But yeah, I think it's just sort of driving this sort of narrative. Now, it was interesting that the original monolith was found to be erected in 2016, I believe is what they're saying. So it's been out there for a while. But nonetheless, I think that was sort of the starting place to kick off all these others. And I think we're just seeing a bunch of copycats with it now. I really can't see any significant meaning other than news stories, where's the next one going to pop up type of thing.
Yeah, it's pretty obviously a sort of viral campaign. But again, I can't help but wonder, in the ancient world, might it have been similar? Again, we see menhirs, standing stones, things like this all over the place. It seems to be a natural human tendency to want to erect a stone and to make some sort of a monument, a monolith, for lack of a better term. And something about the way people are doing it today and the way that this has sort of gone viral in this year of all years, 2020, yeah, it seems to sort of bespeak that earlier tendency throughout history where people have quite obviously exhibited a similar sort of desire to create these sorts of monoliths. I think we see that sort of thing a lot. That's all I'm saying. Just a theory.
Yeah, hey, it's a good theory. So I got a news story for you guys, and it kind of links back to some things that I've talked about in the past, which is my affinity for LiDAR and how I think it's kind of one of the greatest things since sliced bread, I guess you could say. But there's a paper that was written and published in the Journal of Computer Applications in Archaeology. And the title of this paper is Geometry by Design, Contribution of LiDAR to the Understanding of Settlement Patterns of the Mound Villages in Southwest Amazonia.
Oh, wow.
And when we talk about Southwest Amazonia, in this context, we're talking about the western border of Brazil as it butts up against Bolivia. So this paper goes on to describe how they used LiDAR to discover villages that were unknown to science before now. These villages date back to about AD 1000, 1650, kind of a mound building culture, like sort of what we're used to talking about in North America. Probably about the same time period. They used a helicopter to do a LiDAR survey, and they found these low mound villages over a fairly extensive area. The interesting thing about it is the villages are laid out roughly correspondingly to the constellations in the night sky, which is something that we've sort of seen in some other cultures. So the point here is LiDAR is such a good tool for this kind of endeavor. And again, I think that, the days of the Indiana Jones, British archaeologist expedition into the Amazon where they just kind of bust through the brush and hopefully find something, those days are long over. So this LiDAR technology, as I mentioned before, is the future of archaeology, especially, I think, in South America. And we're going to see more of this in the future. And I suspect that we're going to see some really exciting discoveries with this technology.
Certainly. It removes the necessity for going on the ground to an extent. It allows us to see things that wouldn't be easily discernible otherwise. I think about the shell middens that show up on the East Coast, as we observed during a archaeological conference there in South Carolina, Jason, a couple of years back. And the fact that LiDAR is helping us spot things that, again, one would only have known existed if they are able to reach certain areas, but now we can find a lot of them at one time and from the comfort of our armchair. That's the other side of it. And again, that part of it is really interesting because it makes archaeology kind of like what we're seeing in astronomy too, with people, citizen scientists, going and pouring through the data and looking for things and finding new discoveries out there in space from the comfort of their homes using data that has been retrieved. Archaeology is also able to engage with the public in that way, and citizen scientists are able to contribute to archaeological knowledge with data like LiDAR that's now widely available online.
Yeah, and oftentimes when we have universities or other people who have budgets and time constraints to go out and find and document new archaeological sites, while the use of LiDAR can be expensive, it is becoming more prevailing within the discipline of archaeology. So that really helps with utilizing budgets and time and manpower to really find where you want to go and be able to get right on top of a site without wasting a lot of time just hacking through the bush and trying to do test holes and find out exactly where stuff is. This really helps you hone in on exactly where you want to be as far as sites and designating sites and just moving the archaeology along at a faster rate. But 2020, we've all been locked away. Everybody knows this. It's been a COVID year. It's been tough for everyone, but there's still a lot in archaeology that was able to come to the forefront this year. And 2020 actually had quite a few very significant archaeological discoveries. So as this will be the last show of 2020, we just want to take a few minutes to talk about some of the big archaeological discoveries that happened this year in 2020. One of the most fascinating ones, we all love our Clovis discussions and our Peopling of America discussions, but to take it back a little bit further, archaeologists discovered a giant Ice Age mammoth bone structure this past year. They announced this discovery of a giant Ice Age structure built from the remains of at least 60 different mammoths and the Kostinsky-Borshevo Archaeological Complex. Now, that is a giant circular structure. It's 12.5 meters and was built around 25,000 years ago during the peak of the last ice age. This is when we saw communities of hunter-gatherers moving throughout that area. And this particular monument, if you will, would make the oldest known mammoth bone building. It's compared to structures that date till about 22,000 years ago, but this particular one's going back to 25,000 years ago. And if you're able to see that photograph, it is available on the article from Heritage Daily. It's absolutely tremendous in size and very impressive, just nothing like you would ever see anywhere else. But here we are with a huge discovery of this mammoth bone structure, and it is truly impressive. There's several other stories that happened in 2020. I think everybody probably saw the 100 painted coffins that had been found near Saqqara in the necropolis there. That was a big story this year.
Right.
Egyptian antiquity officials announced the discovery this year of almost 100 ancient coffins. Some of them still had mummies inside, but around 40 had golden statues from the ancient Egyptian necropolis there at Saqqara. The wooden coffins and other objects that were buried during the Ptolemaic periods dated from 664 to about 30 BC. But, again, these are very, very impressive, very ornately decorated, and again, in pristine condition as far as that goes. The Saqqara necropolis is a very well-known area, and so it's quite surprising to find something that significant with that many undiscovered coffins. So again, that was a big year for Egyptology. As we look at some of the other stories, we see moving over to China, over 6,000 ancient tombs were discovered by archaeologists in China. Now, archaeologists were excavating throughout the provinces, and they discovered 6,000 ancient tombs that spanned over a time period of 2,000 years.
Wow.
So we had, that's one thing that I wish we could focus more on, is we don't get a lot of information on Chinese archaeology, but with a country so huge, there has to be absolutely fascinating, significant finds there. These particular tombs date from various dynasties and were discovered during construction works. They were building an innovation and technology park, and they happened to run across these, which then expanded out to this very large complex. But again, there's so much archaeology to be discovered there in China. It's really a shame that we're not able to get more information from that area, because it certainly is fascinating. And then a recent article that came out was discussing something that we discussed recently with Dr. Adavasio. But I found this article quite interesting. It was called "Early Big Game Hunters of the Americas Were Female, According to Research." This article talks about, for centuries, historians and scientists, mostly agreed that when early human groups sought food, it were the men that hunted and the women that gathered. Okay, we've all had that discussion. We've talked about this in depth. This particular article, however, talks about a 9,000-year-old female hunter whose burial was discovered in the Andes Mountains of South America, revealed a different story. According to that new research conducted by the University of California at Davis, quote, "An archaeological discovery and analysis of early burial practices overturns the long-held man-the-hunter hypothesis," said Randy Haas, who is the assistant professor of anthropology and lead author of the study. "Female Hunters of the Early Americas" is the name of the article, and it was published November the 4th in Science Advances. According to Haas, he says, quote, "We believe that these findings are particularly timely in light of contemporary conversations surrounding gendered labor practices and inequality. He added, labor practices among recent hunter-gatherer societies are highly gendered, which might lead some to believe that sexist inequalities in things like pay or rank are somehow natural, but it's now clear that sexual division of labor was fundamentally different, like more equitable in our species' deep hunter-gatherers past, end quote. So again, these type of finds and discoveries continue to be made. We often talk about, when we're looking at 13,000 years ago, what's left to find, but there's still certainly things out there. And with that, we'll turn our attention to arguably the biggest archaeological discovery of 2020. I'm referencing an article in The Observer written by Dahlia Albridge, and we're talking about the discovery of the 8-mile-long cliff wall of ochre-infused paintings on this wall. And it's absolutely incredible. So according to the article, it's one of the world's largest collections of prehistoric rock art. It was discovered down in the Amazonian rainforest in a very, very secluded area. It's extremely difficult to get to this area. It's within a national park, but it's being held as the Sistine Chapel of the ancients. Archaeologists have found there literally tens of thousands of paintings of animals and humans, stating currently that they were created up to 12,500 years ago across cliff faces, again, that stretch nearly 8 miles. And this is down in Colombia. Their date is based partly on the depictions of what we see there, which is extinct Ice Age animals. There appears to be mastodon. There appears to be what they're calling paleolama, which is something you don't normally get to say, but paleolamas, as well as extinct species of camels, as well as giant sloths. We see Ice Age horses, all those things that are present there that we would certainly not expect to find. All of these animals were seen and painted by what they believe were some of the very first human inhabitants ever to reach the Amazon. So that really gives us a glimpse into the earliest migrations through that area. The discovery was made last year, but has been kept secret until now. It was being filmed for a major Channel 4 series down in Colombia called Jungle Mystery: Lost Kingdoms of the Amazon. And now that that filming is completed, they'll be able to release more information about the discovery. However, no great archaeological discovery goes without being contested. Now, there are some here in the U.S. and throughout the world who are looking at these paintings and are concerned by the fact that the environment there is extremely wet, it's extremely humid, and many are challenging the validity of the early paintings in that in such a wet and humid environment, would they have been able to last 12,500 years, or were they more recently updated? But again, much information has yet to be released. This is a new discovery, and as of right now, we don't have all those details, and I'm sure we're going to be continued to be updated throughout 2021 and future years as the archaeologists are able to get into the area and spend more time looking at this 8-mile-long stretch of prehistoric art.
That is so fascinating. I mean, in a year like 2020 with so much happening, unfortunately, so much of it has not been good news, but I'm very glad to see that there has been a lot happening in archaeology. And of course, we have continued to provide information about archaeology and interview some of the world's finest experts right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Don't forget, of course, head on over to 7ages.org. You can find all of our information online. Don't forget about our YouTube channel where all our episodes are available, and also some of the documentaries that we have produced. You can also follow us on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook. We appreciate all of the feedback, and of course, don't forget to leave your own feedback. You can drop a review over there on your favorite podcasting app. Those reviews certainly help keep us going and let us know what you guys think about the show. We work very hard, and it has been our privilege yet again to fulfill another year of reporting on what's happening in archaeology. And in fact, we have a discussion to get into right now. Andy Hemmings and Jim Dunbar, who are truly legends in the archaeology, not only of the Southeast, but especially in the great state, the Sunshine State of Florida. Both of these gentlemen managed to coordinate their schedules and make time to join us, and we have quite a conversation about Paleoindian archaeology along the Aucilla River and other locations in the Sunshine State. We're going to cover all of that and, of course, those enigmatic earlier-than-Clovis sites when we return right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. We have quite a conversation about archaeology in Pleistocene-era Florida tonight, and two very special guests to join us for this, experts in this field whose brains that we certainly want to pick. Now, first up is Andy Hemmings. He grew up in Minnesota around the Twin Cities, a place near and dear to my heart, even though I'm a Carolina boy. Now, in 1991, he graduated from the University of Arizona with a BA in anthropology, and after doing contract archaeology for a time, he worked in the Navajo Nation Historic Preservation Department before heading to graduate school at the University of Florida. Now, Hemmings received his Anthropology Masters in 1999 and Ph.D. in 2004 from University of Florida, followed by a Post-doctoral Fellowship with the Gault Project at the University of Texas. Before we proceed with introductions, first allow me to welcome you to the program, Dr. Hemmings. Andy, as he prefers to be called, how are you?
Very good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you for being here with us. It's truly an honor. Also joining us, we got a 2-for-1 tonight, Jim Dunbar. He is an archaeologist with a research focus on Paleoindian and pre-Clovis populations, primarily in Florida, as you might have guessed. He was an employee with the Bureau of Archaeological Research and is now engaged full-time in archaeological research. He has an extensive publication record and completed his Ph.D. in anthropology in 2012. Never too late to get that Ph.D., ladies and gents. Now, his research includes the excavations at Wakulla Springs, funded by National Geographic, as well as the Norden site and Page-Ladson, a site which some listeners of this podcast will be familiar with, and dozens of other sites. And, as we have heard, he has probably seen more Paleoindian sites than anyone in Florida. So, without further ado, Dr. Dunbar, Jim as he prefers to be called, welcome to the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here tonight.
Yeah, we are glad to have both of you gentlemen here. A brief introductory question, and I think I'll toss this one to Andy. You and Jim have both been very involved in Pleistocene-era archaeology in Florida, and for years. In order to kind of set the stage for this discussion, could you give us a bit of a background about the landscape in Florida during the Pleistocene, the dynamics that might have facilitated some of the state's earliest archaeological sites, and why they are so significant today?
Sure. That is hardly a yes or no question. The last glacial maximum, the maximum amount of ice tied up, 2 miles thick over the top of Erie, more than a mile thick on top of Chicago, was about 22,000 years ago. At that time, Florida would have been a little bit more than double in size. The water table would have, the shore sea level would be down 375 feet, give or take, depending on where you are, and a wealth of animals, even some plants that are no longer here. We're living in communities that we don't really have a good analogy for. So that's why every time we find something new, it's particularly interesting to learn something new about not just mammoths, mastodons, bison, 2 kinds of extinct llamas, 2 kinds of capybaras. I could go on for about 5 minutes to get through the list of those. And what's particularly compelling to us, Jim and I and the people we work with, is that for a number of reasons, largely involving preservation, and we'll spend probably a good amount of time talking about this, the first people that get into Florida 14, 15 plus thousands of years ago got to live for 1, 2, 3,000 years with a wealth of plant and animal life that ceased to exist, that it just winks out of existence about 10,000 years ago, give or take. And that as the sea level starts to rise, that wealth of plant and animal life and some early humans sort of gets squished down into, modern Florida. And what happens is that eventually those very sparsely scattered people and surviving extinct Pleistocene animals become archaeologically visible. And that's what Jim and I have specialized in trying to locate.
Right. Yes, again, there are so many dynamics to try and cover. Now, here at the outset, I think it would also be apropos to come over to you for a moment, Jim. You ran the Aucilla River Prehistory Project for many years, along with Dave Webb and others whose names we will mention over the course of the conversation. That was an archaeological and paleontological project excavating a particularly rich series of deposits that yielded ancient megafaunal remains, and that, of course, in association with Paleoindian artifacts. Can you give us an overview of how that project came to be?
Well, a river diver that I knew at the time, a fellow named Don Serbasic, had been talking for years about how he wanted people to come in, researchers to come in and look at some of these unusual sites underwater, and he wrote an article in the Florida Anthropologist in early 1983, sort of challenging us to come in and look at a particular site in the half-mile rise section of the Aucilla, and we did that in 1983. But we looked at this one site that he told us about, and we could see where the sediment had been disturbed a little bit. So we looked at other places and actually had some other people come in that were familiar with the river. Not too many people dive in water that looks like dark roast coffee. You don't have very much visibility in it. And one of those divers was an ex-SEAL named Buddy Page. And Dave Webb and I went along with him one day. He was just going to show us a few locations. We had a few locations we wanted to look at. And we dove until about lunchtime, and we anchored right out in front of what they call the Wakulla Race. And the Wakulla Race is where the water comes in at a higher elevation and flows into the Aucilla at a lower elevation, and it's not exactly a waterfall, but it's a beautiful location. Anyway, after lunch, Buddy Page looked at us and he said, "Do you want to really see a good site?" And that was the Page-Ladson site. He put on his tank, went down, and came back up and had a couple of elephant bones in one hand and a sloth bone in the other. And, "Is this what y'all are looking for?"
Wow.
And yeah, it was. And so from 1984 until 1997, we worked on that site. We actually worked all the way up to 1999, but in 1999 we looked at a different site. But it is in a sinkhole 30 feet below present sea level. And depending on what sediment level you're in, you either had shallow water sediments, perhaps sometimes a subaerial exposure of the sinkhole bottom because the water tables drop that low, and at other times you had maybe a slowly flowing river, but you had water high enough where it could flow from one end to the other like it more or less does today. And you can tell that by the sediment deposition. But anyway, that's how we found it. And once we did that in 1984, we did an excavation downriver from where we actually found the main place that we dug for a long time. But what we did find is a very deep sediment sequence, and the bottom of that sequence, I think, dated 12,400 radiocarbon, which is about 14,400 radiocarbon. And in doing that, we found early archaic level up higher than that, and some other artifact levels that convinced us we needed to stay there, but we sort of moved to the bank of, you'd have to know the river, but we moved into the bank of deposition and away from the bank of erosion, and that's where we hit the mother lode.
Yeah, and the mother lode, as we began to get into this tonight, in and around this Aucilla River area, the whole region is an archaeological treasure that is particularly rich. And we're very much looking forward to get into this conversation tonight, and no better place to start than with the Page-Ladson site. So I understand there was up to 16 field seasons up to 1999 at the Page-Ladson site. So we've got that good introduction. So as we began to get into the details of the excavations, again, let's revisit this site for a moment. What is it about Page-Ladson that made it so distinct as far as a lithic debutage, or as far as animal remains that are being found?
Well, when we first started, a lot of what lays on the bottom of that sinkhole, or at least at that time, I guess you could call it sort of a channel leg. it wasn't that it really moved downstream. A channel lag is where everything winnows out and you have big particles laying on the bottom. And it was a Pleistocene smorgasbord of bones. There were a lot of lithic artifacts, but of all ages, some ceramic even. And what we did is we went sort of snooping around to try to find out where we could find in-place sediments and where the in-place, where were the things eroding out from. And once we understood that, we could find the in-place sediment, and that's exactly what we did. And by 1993, Dave Webb had gotten a team of outside researchers in, Vance Haynes and people like that, to sort of do a review of what we'd done up until that date. And they gave us, suggestions, and we followed their suggestions and did a lot of very careful sampling and things like that.
Absolutely. Jim, while we're over here with you also, arguably one of the most well-known and well-recognized recoveries from Page-Ladson does involve this famous tusk, and the fact that it bears cut marks would be of particular interest. Can we talk a little bit about the conditions in relation to what you're discussing there, under which this was found sedimentologically, and of course the obvious significance of the cut marks on the item in question?
Okay, well, if you could look at a river that had eroded out on the bank of erosion side versus the bank of deposition side, we were digging into a wedge. And we got to the top of the wedge and dug down, and it was about 3.5, 4 meters of sediment to get down to the bone bed. And in 1993 or 4, is the year we came down on the mastodon tusk. In Unit 3 was the bone bed. And as soon as you get the sediment above Unit 3 is it's like pipe clay. It's very difficult to dig in. And it takes you forever in one field season to get to the bone bed. But once you get to the bone bed, you can do all kinds of careful excavation. And doggone if we didn't uncover, of course, in one half of a unit, half of the tusk, and the other part of the tusk was buried up under the bank. But that part had the cut marks. And it gave us incentive to go and move another unit over so we could get the whole tusk out. And that was later used to date the animal. It was later used to determine age of death. Looking at the ivory growth bands, do isotope analysis, and that's how they determined the animal had been migrating between Georgia and Florida. So I assume maybe like the Africans do today, that animal was, moving from one place to the other, probably based on water, because mastodons, unlike a mammoth, have marine mammal hair, and they like water. They were like giant pigs, as far as I can see. But anyway, very interesting, and we found other, parts of the animal, and in amongst that, a flint chip here and there, and one utilized flake, those kind of things. Not a great number of artifacts, but some artifacts, and that they had come from, underneath 2 or 3 meters of very dense sediment. It was sealed in, and that's ended up being the real convincer as far as it being an old site.
Andy, I'd like to come over to you for a moment. With regard to what Jim is talking about, and of course with your familiarity with so many sites, in different parts of Florida. Maybe we could also talk about the way that we're able to track the movement of the animal in question as he describes from Georgia over into Florida. What might that tell us, not only about Pleistocene megafauna and their movement throughout the southeast and other regions, but maybe also subsistence patterns that would have been followed by ancient Americans at that time?
You hit on something really interesting and sort of obliquely that actually matters to us today. The vast majority of people walking around the country have no idea that a huge percentage of our highway system follows old game trails. Essentially what were historic trails prior to being Native American trails that oftentimes were co-opted from the animals. Mammoths and mastodons are gigantic animals on that landscape, and they walk an awful lot and leave really nice highways, if you want to call them such a thing. And so what you're referring to is that the groundwater, where every animal, every person, or even, you could do it in trees. I confess, I don't know if anyone's ever tried looking for strontium in plants, but I'm sure somebody has. I'm not aware of it. But in everyone's teeth, the strontium, as your teeth grew and developed, and your bones as well, but accumulates a trace amount of strontium that indicates what the level was in the groundwater where you grew up. So in the case we're talking about, if you were a mastodon that at some point unfortunately perished, 14,500 years ago at Page-Ladson, and we looked at your teeth, we could tell, and this is in fact what was done, that these animals, these mastodons there, were migrating out of Florida, probably onto the upland areas of Georgia, not terribly far from Atlanta. And because of the way that tusks grow, you can actually see alternating light and dark bands, basically indicative of annual rings. It's almost akin to tree rings, but it's mammoth tusks, or in this case, mammoth.
Interesting.
So what happens is we could tell that the mastodons were leaving Florida probably in January, when there's, in fact, a dry season and probably starved for water. The mammoths, on the other hand, and this is from not just Page-Ladson, but a number of sites across North Florida all the way down to Vero that were sampled of both mammoth and mastodon specimens, that the mammoths were very differently behaved than the mastodons. The mastodons probably provided a better conduit for the movement of people, because it's easy for people to walk on elephant trails.
That's fascinating. Yeah. The dendrochronology of mammoth tusks, although it wouldn't actually be that, but I mean, it's similar. That's fascinating.
The biochronology is telling you its life story, but science has gotten so small in the last 5 years, but even these things that we're able to do 20 years ago, things you wouldn't have thought to ask 50 years ago can tell us where that animal spent its winters and summers.
Wow.
Yeah, and along this line of discussion, this would be a perfect time to introduce what Dave Webb was calling the Gulf Coast Savannah Corridor in reference to Gomphothere. So, Andy, can you explain what that actually means in reference to late Pleistocene Florida?
Sure. Dave really formalized an idea with concrete examples from Florida that had been espoused by George Gaylord Simpson in 1930, and in fact, it's really not his idea. It dates back into the middle of the 19th century. And I'm failing to give credit where it's due, but many people have thought of these things, but what Dave put together is concrete examples from Florida sites at the end of the Pleistocene and earlier for other things, that basically, when Florida was double in size, you have all that shallow, low-lying, exposed continental shelf that is also the place where the superficial aquifer is most likely to express itself. And just a quick example is that the majority of first magnitude freshwater springs in Florida are certainly within 20 miles, maybe even 10 miles of the current coast. Basically, the freshwater floats on the saltwater. So as the sea level goes down, the concentration of easily accessible fresh water is out there on that continental shelf. So animals coming from South America, some things from North America going to South America, have a fairly unimpeded, low, flat, now exposed continental shelf to walk back and forth on. So you see a lot of very interesting things come up from South America, the sloths, probably Glyptodont. I say Glyptodont like everyone should know what that is. It's a armored little relative, very distant relative of the armadillos. But think of a round, dumpy armadillo that weighs, or Glyptodont that looks like a Volkswagen Bug and is about 2/3 the size of one, probably weighs 400 to 600 pounds or somewhere in that range. That these things are migrating and coming into Florida, and like I said, sea level pushes them up, and whatever the last survivors would be on peninsular Florida today, basically give us a glimpse into things, how things moved, that until David really sort of sorted out how the mechanism of that, the species that are genuinely affected, and that we're making use of that corridor, was kind of not well conceived until he put it together in his book on mammals in '74.
That's a whole other world that I think most people don't even know existed. And Jim, I was thinking about what you were talking about with the depositional environment, where the bones and the artifacts were found, and it sounded like you were saying that you excavated a point bar close to the shore, or close to the edge of the river.
It is definitely not a point bar.
Oh, it's not?
It's just an odd feature that you get in karst environments like that.
Okay.
And it was more on the bank of erosion side. A lot of erosion took place. On the bank of deposition side, the sediments that had slowly built up in horizontal. There was none of this striking upwards towards a riverbank. As far as we've ever gone in towards a riverbank, all the sediment levels are laying flat. They're not coming up like you'd see in a river system. It's counterintuitive. I know that.
Okay, and that's why I had it backwards.
It's a classic, probably sinkhole fill in a way. Cutting took place, and it took out, the bank of erosion side and left the bank of deposition side. But in doing so, the river was never that swift enough. So the artifacts and fossils didn't really move downstream. They just sort of deflated, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, you answered my next question, because I was curious if the materials were transported there, and if so, where. But it sounds like that they pretty much where the animals died is where you found them.
If you look at the half-mile rise section of the Aucilla, it's like a moonscape. You'll have shallow banks that are 2 to 3 meters deep, interrupted by a sinkhole that goes down 28, 30 feet. And then all of a sudden you have another shallow bank, and it just repeats itself all the way down. And what seems to be happening there, I'm getting sort of off track a little bit. There are many sinkholes in the river, and the one Page-Ladson happened to be just perfect for Paleoindian age, but there's other sinkholes in the river where we're getting carbon dates that are 47,000 years old. I mean, these sinkholes infilled at different times, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is all extremely valuable information, because as we discuss the Aucilla and the surrounding area, it's not like the typical river. If you're a listener out there and you're not familiar with this type of karst environment in this river, it's a very unique setting that lends itself to this type of preservation. So we're not talking about the normal dynamics of what you would consider when you're looking at a typical type of river. Now, as far as Page-Ladson goes, we're looking at a sort of an enclosed system there. We've now described the remains of some of the animals, but what about the famous, what we would call the most obvious bifacial lithic that was recovered from the site? Give us a description of that and the importance of how and where it was found.
Well, actually, that would be a question for Jessie Halligan, because she actually recovered that. and it was in the Unit 3 sediments, but I wasn't there when that took place. The beauty of Page-Ladson is I was always taught you never dig an entire archaeological site. And I'm not making this up. My professor would tell, Charles Fairbanks would tell me, you always leave part of that site there because there are going to be technologies in the future that will answer questions you will not believe. And that has taken place. But anyway, I forgot where I was going with that. Sorry.
Well, that's a very important point that you make right there. Again, we've asked the same thing during a recent Legacy Series edition of this podcast with J.M. Adovasio. Many people have said, will you continue to excavate Meadowcroft Rock Shelter? Now, presently they are not. And again, I bring it up because it's comparable to Page-Ladson in terms of the significance of that site in relation to the Clovis pre-Clovis debate. But they've recently done environmental DNA studies there. I guarantee you in 20 years there will be new technologies, new kinds of analyses that can be performed there. It's going to be a game changer. Why remove all that earth right now? Andy, since Jim has brought that point to the table, would you want to chime in on that?
Sure. I kind of want to couch it, if you don't mind, in a step back a moment about the depositional history here and how unusual the rivers really are.
Please.
They are flat at very low energy, and that means that the accumulated sediments oftentimes are made of nothing more than leaves that are pressed together after thousands of years. Before things go from being a raw pile of leaves at Page-Ladson, every year between the seasons of excavation, there would be between 6 and 10 feet of new leaves deposited right there. And one of the things we found, I confess Jim would know better if this was in the upper layers of the strata there, but at Sloth Hole, another site we'll probably touch on in a little bit, one of the layers we found was a 5,000 or 4,500-year-old layer of leaves that were compressed together, and they were becoming a peat, but they were not yet a peat. They're a thing called a sapropel. And it basically was like a French loaf. And if you broke it open, you could see individual leaves that were roughly 5,000 years old sitting in there. But if you tried to pick one up, it was basically the ghosts. And I realize sounds ridiculous. It's like the shell of a leaf. It's almost like onion skin that would just disintegrate when you touched it. So you could see the thing. Well, 20 years ago, they were fascinating, but you could do little more than maybe take a picture of it and get the species from it. Now, there's a host of things that can be done. The ancient DNA of the organism itself, even DNA of parasites living on leaves. We can determine all manner of different levels of the trophic suite of things living at any given location at any given time now. Things that even in our own work from Jim and I 20 years ago, we wouldn't have thought to do. It wasn't possible. Now is commonplace.
Yeah.
DNA isotopes, the ability to date ever smaller and smaller fragments of organic carbon ever more precisely and accurately is that revolution has not even settled in yet. Our technology is getting well out in front of our conceptualization of what to do and how to make sense of all this data.
Yeah, and boy, there is a lot of data to process. Again, another aspect of this is even what is removed from the Earth, nonetheless, can still be subjected to new kinds of analyses and processes. That reminds me, I don't recall if this actually was from Page-Ladson, but Jim, you'd be the guy to ask. We had been talking prior to starting the conversation about the oldest gourd seed and its prospective date. Which site complex had that been located at, and how old do we think it actually may be?
Well, at Page-Ladson, it started out having the record for the oldest gourd seed at about 14,500. And then Andy went down and looked at a site called Latvis Simpson. And the gourd seeds from that, when you calibrate them, they're in the 34,000 year range.
Now I'm sorry, that's the date of that's the radiocarbon date, but again, there's no evidence of charred remains or anything associated with human activity, right?
Well, I will let Andy address that issue.
Okay. Sure.
Very kind of you gentlemen to pull the pin on that grenade before you landed it in my lap. And it was very delicately done. It was bravo, you. So, mercifully, the gourd seed date that Jim is referring to specifically came from a sample of mastodon dung, or we call it digesta, really. It's the polite term that means we don't know if it was still in the animal or if it had already been left the building, shall we say. Mercifully, our longtime dive master and videographer, Joe Latvis, videotaped me on high 8 video with a brand new clean trowel and a baggie, cutting a little square in this digesta sediment between the tusks of a roughly 17-year-old mastodon that had died while she was pregnant at this waterhole. I cut a new face of the wall and cut a block about the size of a brick of this digesta, and it's really a combination of fine white sand that's filtered into all of these chewed twigs and seeds and every manner of thing that the animals were eating, leaves and whatnot. And literally, we figured out at Page-Ladson that this was, in fact, from the contents of a mastodon and not a mammoth, which has grinding occlusional surfaces. But the high crowns of the mastodon were chopping these things into roughly 2-inch long pieces. Pulled the sample, bagged it on film, perfectly clean trowel, brand new Ziploc baggie. They teased me as though I was doing a commercial for Ziploc. Pulled it up to the surface, drained the little bit of water that was with it off, sealed it up, FedExed it to Lee Newsom's laboratory, then at Southern Illinois University, and my very near and dear friend who ended up, he has a Ph.D. in paleontology now, a man named Matt Nobachler, calls me up after he opens the sample up and starts to take it apart to look for what botanical remains are in there and what we can do with them, and chews me out as though and basically lights into me and doesn't even tell me why he's mad at me for a little bit, because there was an artifact in it. And he thought I was playing a terrible, terrible practical joke, which I absolutely was not. And quite literally, thank goodness, my sampling was on film. You can watch it yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. So what we found, or what Matt found, is the little lipped edge of a biface. It's a flake from the edge of a biface made of this grayish, sort of patinaed or weathered a little bit khaki, fairly grainy chert that has never been seen before or since in Florida. So that's it, guys. 34,000 years old, material never seen in Florida, came from the edge of a water hole where a mastodon had died.
Okay, hold on. Let's back up. This is an incredible story. So we're talking about an actual lithic sample that was retrieved from this, again, this plant matter that you sent for analyses, and this dates to, again, roughly, you say 34,000 years ago?
It's about 34,000 calibrated, not, but I need to go back. Those, with the new calibration program, it makes it a lot tighter, and I have not done that yet. But I think Andy and I would both agree, one artifact does not make a site, but you can't ignore that, and you cannot not report it. And wouldn't you agree with that, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I've included it in a publication about pre-Clovis material that Jim Audavazio and I did after a Smithsonian symposium called Pre-Clovis in the Americas. I presented it there. I've presented it numerous times. I basically just throw it out there and say, I don't know how to explain it. I don't think it's easily explained away. The methodologically, I couldn't have done it any tighter than that. And thank goodness that it's on video. I don't have a good explanation for it, but here's what I got. So that's what I got.
That's fascinating, though, Andy. What a story. James, jump in there.
One of you, Andy or Jim. So you were talking about the chert type that had never been found in Florida before, and I was just curious about it. And as I always am for these archaeological sites, is the quarry sites or the origination points for the types of lithic material that was found on site. So I was already planning to ask that question, but the grainy gray chert. Do you know where that came from?
No, I have no idea, and Jim would probably be the better person to answer that.
Right, and actually the best person to perhaps answer that is a guy named Adam Burke that's doing his Ph.D. right now at Texas A&M, and that's his thing, is tracing source material. The one thing you need to realize in the Aucilla River Basin, that's the Aucilla and the Wakulla and that whole drainage system, is one of the largest chert quarry clusters in the state of Florida. Everybody was getting their material from there, so it could be local, but we don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's another interest of mine, is tracing materials and quarry sites. So, certainly interested in that. As the mystery continues, we have to move on because we have many other sites. We just want to let listeners know that if you do want to hear more about that Page-Ladson site, you can refer to episode 27 of the 7 Ages Audio Journal with our interview with Dr. Jessie Halligan, where she'll explain that site in more depth. But we need to move on now to the Sloth Hole site. And so, Andy, we're going to turn it over to you. And let's begin with a description of the Sloth Hole site, and so we can kind of build an idea of what we're envisioning as far as that site's concerned.
Sure. Well, when the water table is noticeably lower at the time that we still have the mammoths and mastodons and the earliest folks running around Florida, Sloth Hole is essentially an isolated sinkhole about 30 feet deep with little tiny seep springs in it that are fairly continuous. We know of at least 4 of them there today that are still flowing up out of the bedrock. It's essentially a consistent water hole in a fairly dry, grassland landscape. Very unlike Florida's grasslands. It's not the woodland that you think of today. And so we know that there are people there during Clovis time in abundance. There's a hint of potentially some pre-Clovis, or I should say older than Clovis, occupation and use of the site. The first divers started getting into that spot probably around 1960, give or take a few, and it's a sinkhole. It's about 150 feet across, and today, if a hurricane comes and the water goes out into the Gulf and it drops the water table 5 feet, it becomes a sinkhole again. At the southern end, it only needs to be dropped about 2 feet. At the north end, it probably needs to be 4 feet and change. And you can see the outline of the sinkhole again, because that's how shallow it is. But the middle of it's, like I said, 30, 32 feet deep, and a tremendous draw. And what it really looks like was occurring there is that certainly by Clovis time, people were acquiring stone downstream at the southern tip of this portion of the Aucilla. We call it the west run of the Aucilla, and about a kilometer away, maybe a little more than half a mile away downstream, was a quarry called Fossil Hole. It looks like they were roughing out big chunks of stone, taking them back to the water hole where they're essentially camped out or spending time, and really manufacturing finished products there, both stone and ivory. We can come to that in a minute. But in addition to making and using these things, they are in fact probably looks like there may have been a young mastodon that was butchered there, and a host of other, plant and animal resources were certainly utilized by the people at Sloth Hole 15,000 years ago.
Andy, as far as the animals that were and the other kinds of resources that were exploited there at Sloth Hole, something that really struck me, and this is somewhat similar in truth to Page-Ladson with the scoring that we found on a mastodon tusk. With regard to Sloth Hole, we also have a taper jaw that had scratches on it. Can you talk about that a bit and what that might indicate?
Sure. Taper is a site that's present paleontologically, across the southern half of the United States at the end of the Pleistocene. But it only occurs at a handful of archaeological sites. And by that, I mean simply that it is present when we think people are there as well. And did they utilize it? Did they make a meal or tools, or did they eat it? The evidence for that is very rare. Well, so at Sloth Hole, there is a jaw that has very unnatural scratches, maybe cut marks on it. It's, at the time we found it, some of the better evidence or better possible evidence for utilization of that species. It turns out that a couple of years after we found that, actually down at Fossil Hole, we dug 1 square meter as a test excavation. So, a half mile away. So almost assuredly the same people at this time. We dug 1 square meter just to count the lithics, and because I was taking a lot of heat when I said there are millions of flakes at this site. And I kind of got laughed off of it, and I kind of got irritated. So we dug 1 square meter and had 42,000 lithics in 1 square meter.
Wow.
And that included 6 cores that weighed between 50 and 86 pounds, which means you could have doubled the number of flakes if you wanted to.
Ladies and gentlemen, Andy Hemmings is not kidding when he gives you those numbers.
47,000 flakes per cubic meter.
That's incredible.
1 square meter.
Wow.
Yeah, and we dug to bedrock, and the really interesting thing is the lower level was a slightly different colored sediment, about, I say it was 37 or 40 centimeters thick, 17,000 or 19,000 lithics in that level. In that unit, in the lowest level, around number 20,000 lithics, capped by another 25,000 lithics, was 1 taper limb, and all of the bone was calcined. It had been burned.
Wow.
So that's probably the best evidence and direct association with artifacts. Unlike the one at at Lambeth Simpson, I got 20,000 in this layer of 1 square meter. So I think it's a pretty tight association that thing didn't just fall in there and get burned.
Well, I was going to ask about the cores. It sounds like they didn't roll those there. Those were probably much bigger, bigger boulders at some time, and they just whittled them down to, how you found them.
Yeah, tested cobbles, basically, knocking big chunks off or spalls and deciding if they want to use that piece or not, and taking and moving on. The bedrock there is actually lenses of this incredibly, it's clear, whitish with a bluish hue when it's raw and in its native form. And so many of the famous artifacts of Sloth Hole, in particular, the big Clovis point, it's stained brownish black. But if you hold it up to light, you can actually see through it. That thing was clear.
Wow.
It's incredible church. You recognize it readily when you see it.
Yeah.
It looks crystalline almost. It's really high quality in stone.
That's remarkable to be able to see. Again, down there in those coastal plains, the chert is just remarkable. And we see from time to time similar kinds of cherts a little further east, where the guys and I are familiar with, and you can literally hold it up to light and see right through it and all those beautiful inclusions and things. Andy, also, maybe we could talk about giant armadillo while we're discussing the different variety of fauna from the Pleistocene that have turned up at Sloth Hole.
Yeah, there's a handful of sites, and really the most varied and most taxa abundant or rich faunules really boil down to Sloth Hole, Page-Ladson, and Bureau. And for whatever reason, those 3 sites produce an inordinate number of the rarest animals that we know are on the Pleistocene landscape. And I'm strictly, it's a big asterisk to put on this, but I specifically mean not paleontologically. These animals occur at a number of places, but that hopeful little overlap between humans and the taxa that are going extinct. There are very few other examples. Glyptodont, for example, which we mentioned earlier, is present at all 3 of those sites, and Louisville out in Texas, and that's it. It's not even on the menu, if you will, anywhere else. Same with some of the capybaras. They're both present at Vero. They're also, one of them, the smaller one, is present also at Vero. The larger one is also present at Page-Ladson. And that's it for North America. Holmesina is the name of the giant armadillo.
Right.
And that's a really particularly interesting animal in and of itself. That occurs at probably maybe 10 archaeological sites, including all 3, Vero, Sloth Hole, and Page-Ladson. But there's even less information that people ever utilize that animal. But for the first time, directly dated 3 out of they're armored, they have dermal armor or shells like the current armadillos. We directly dated 3 of those down at Vero. 2 of them are immediately pre-Clovis or a Clovis bullseye at 11,300 radiocarbon, or probably about 13,100 to 200 calibrated. So I can't say for sure that people had anything to do with their demise or even interacted with them, but based on recent evidence, and now we've found more from the Aucilla in other sites and some collections that we've recently had donated to the Aucilla Research Institute. We're going to have more and better information about these animals, and now know that they are all together in the Aucilla Basin at a brief window that we focus on.
Yeah. In addition to the specificity of the different kinds of animal kills that may be, again, implied by the archaeology at Sloth Hole, I'm also fascinated by the fact that in relation to Page-Ladson, you mentioned that we may be tracking the same group of individuals as they move through this terrain.
Yeah, well, so a couple of things that traditionally people that hunt elephants, and this is largely African examples, they're really easy to find because they leave gigantic footprints and they travel in packs. And they eat, 300 pounds of browse a day. And that means the digesta that they leave behind is, you track them by orientation, direction of the footprints, how old they are, as well as you can tell by, the weathering of the ridges and whatnot, and how dry the boluses that they've left behind of poop. It gives you basically time and direction, and so the trails that they lead almost invariably directly to and from water holes. So if you want to know where to go, follow the elephant, and that's really, I think, what we are trying to get a better handle on, how people did that. At some point, exotic stone in Florida from Paleoindian sites is very rare. So if we get into a site where we find Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama material being deposited, there's a pretty good chance we can start talking about the directionality of travel of the Paleoindian people themselves, not just some of the game that they were known to utilize.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of Sloth Hole and the many amazing finds that have been located in that area, Sloth Hole also is home to many Clovis points, as well as what could be considered a very rare ivory workstation. So let's discuss both the Clovis points that have been discovered at Sloth Hole, in addition to this ivory workstation.
Sure. And they're sort of overlapping, sort of nested sets of data. And so we have blanks or early stage bifaces, or what we might in fact call preforms, being brought to Sloth Hole. So even the broken pieces we find are essentially already far enough along the trajectory to becoming a Clovis point that we recognize that this is Clovis technology. The way they made the pieces particularly straight early on, that if you flipped it on the edge, it's straight, and the edge is centered, which is really quite a trick in mapping. How things are fluted, the groove that's a flake knocked off the base, how do you prepare the platform, the bevel at the base to get that set up, and there's a whole host of very diagnostic characters that individually, it's hard to say yes or no, maybe. You may not even be able to tell. But in concert, when you look at the roughly 25 different characters that we're looking for to diagnose a Clovis biface or point, then you start seeing patterns. And that's really what we're talking about, is pattern recognition in the lithic technology. Well, if you're really good at it, at the manufacture of these things, it comes out pretty clear and you know right away. Well, we are talking about family groups and some slightly bigger, band organization that we frankly have no, real idea of how many people we're talking about. Probably on the order of, 2 or 3 nuclear family size bands that could be, say, just for argument's sake, 4 people apiece, and there's 3 or 4 of those. You have probably a dozen people. Maybe as many as 20 is probably about the carrying capacity of, everybody's got to go to the bathroom. You got to use firewood all in the immediate area. You're going to use it up pretty quick, in a matter of a few days. So much beyond that on a regular basis is probably unlikely. But you have everyone from, infants up to adults, and of all ages. So you're not born knowing how to make a Clovis point any more than you are knowing how to drive a stick shift. And so you have to learn. And that's one of the really exciting and important things that we've learned about several manufacturing sites. And I really got schooled on this by Mike Collins at Gault, using examples from the monstrous Clovis site out there. And so suddenly realized there was young people presumably, learning how to make Clovis points at Slots Hole. And we have a number of beginner pieces, probably about 20 of them now that are recognizable. And one of the ways we diagnose those is that simply they're making the piece as straight as they can. They're flaking in flakes that go all the way across overshot or outrepassé flakes. They're trying to do that, but it's not working, or really the flakes beyond midline is the most common pattern in it, in a lot of the Clovis bifaces. It's the tune is right, but they're hitting a lot of sour notes, and you really see okay, they fluted it just right, but it went off at a 45-degree angle from where they were trying to go. Or, it's straight, but the tip is curled off to the side. They just didn't get it right, and it's very clear they're doing many of the steps correctly and some not at all, and that's sort of been a very fun thing to both develop my own intellectual ability to see it. And there's a lot of people can understand this now, but I confess I didn't know how to figure that out when I was in grad school. But now I recognize this looks like Clovis, but you can't really say it is. Well, part of the reason is it's somebody who is learning how to make Clovis points, and figuring that out is really a really interesting anthropological phase of the work that we get to do.
Oh, it certainly is. And I guess it's really kind of appropriate, considering that we are having this conversation in the latter part of October, that we would be discussing some of these Paleoindian sites in Florida. Wakulla Springs, for instance, of course, has quite a history with regard to films that, of course, aficionados of the horror genre, universal horror films, will be familiar with. The Creature from the Black Lagoon. I hear that film come up in conversation an awful lot about this site, Andy.
I confess I was wearing a Creature from the Black Lagoon shirt today.
Aha! I figured as much.
Now, technically, I don't. These are complicated paleontological questions, but we ourselves have not actually found a Creature from the Black Lagoon in our excavation. That's
what you aspire to do, but you haven't found it yet. Still looking.
We're working. We have top scientists working on this night and day.
Good.
We're trying to get it resolved by Halloween.
Yeah. Well, that'll be very timely.
Yeah, perfect time of the year for this conversation. And so, Jim, we want to turn the conversation over to you, and let's begin with Wakulla Springs, an area that has been long and well established in Florida, but has been getting a lot of press in the last few years for the incredible discoveries there. So let's begin, as we have with the rest of our sites that we discussed this evening. Let's give a description of the site, and then let's get into the details.
Okay. Would you mind if I talked a little bit about how we got there to begin with?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Well, I've got to go back briefly to Page-Ladson. At Page-Ladson, we found projectile points that were not in place. They don't count. They're not in place. And there was this one type that's real oddball. It's made on a thin flake. It looks like it's fluted, but it's not, because it has the original thin flake flat part still on it. Well, the late Calvin Jones, who was a state archaeologist, did a dig at Wakulla Springs, and when he did, he dug up a Simpson Point preform, and just a little bit deeper in the ground, a Page-Ladson point. So that's the reason we wanted to go there and look, because here's another site that has the Page-Ladson point, and the Page-Ladson point had been found at Page-Ladson at Half Mile Rise Sink in the Aucilla, but never in place, and we wanted to find out where it would be in place. So he did go back and spent one season there in 2008, and then a few other seasons, 2017, 2018. But we were digging. We had two missions. we wanted to dig on land and identify the Paleoindian level, and we wanted to look out offshore at a mastodon site to see if we could tie temporally those things together or not, to see if the Paleoindian artifact assemblage on land was at all related or possibly related to the mastodon offshore. But sort of synthesizing it down, long story short, in one of the test pits, we dug down and found Simpson Point, which I'm the one in a book that's been published on Paleoindians of the coastal southeast that has revised the projectile point typology for Paleoindian artifacts. And what many people have been calling Simpson points are not. They just aren't. They're not made like a Simpson point. They're a wasted Swanee point or a recurved Swanee point. The Simpson point is a whole different animal. Its flaking pattern is similar to, but dissimilar from Clovis in that they're taking these giant flakes off, but they're not going across the face and they're not fluting the point. And I think a Simpson point really is a knife, but that's another story. We excavated on land and about 1 meter and 10 centimeters down or thereabouts, recovered the first Simpson point ever excavated from context.
Wow.
And what was interesting about that is we had some problems dating. We used OSL dating there, which is optically stimulated luminescence dating. And it was good that we did because it gave us a feel for the stratigraphic integrity of the site. And there had been some disturbance. We believe that disturbance was 10,000 or more years of ants burrowing through the ground where they're able to move sand grains around. But you can still get a date or maybe 2 dates that are the likely age of that sediment level in a real loose sandy soil. So there were a number of indicators that the site had good stratigraphic integrity. And we got the Simpson point, and it was located below what Chris Moore identified as the platinum anomaly. It's about 10 centimeters below that. The platinum anomaly is probably best dated in the Greenland ice core at something like 12,896 plus or minus 4 years. And it has something to do with, I don't know if an impact or an airburst or a giant volcanic event. It's probably extraterrestrial because they've found it worldwide now. South Africa, South America, Europe, and the Americas. I mean, and it's one of the best chronostratigraphic markers found. So anybody doing Paleoindian research should go after and see if they can identify the platinum anomaly. So that's the best date we have on the Simpson. So we're reckoning that it is somewhere in the neighborhood of before Clovis, maybe 13,003, 200, 400 years old. We don't know. We don't have an exact date. But what was interesting for having gone through the exercise on land, Andy got in and did the underwater excavation on the Vickery Mastodon, which I could take a stone, or when I was younger, I could take a stone and throw it and probably hit the Mastodon site. We're on a hill overlooking the head springs at Wakulla Springs, and Andy's offshore just beyond the swimming area and did an excavation. And rather than me do a spoiler alert, I'd rather have him talk about that excavation.
Sure.
Do you guys want to go there right now?
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, certainly. And that's the thing, too. And this is a microcosm of why that inundated continental shelf out in the Gulf of Mexico needs to be considered part of the same landscape as the sites that we're working inland. And this example, they're about 400 feet apart with about 16 feet of elevation change. And just because one is underwater now really shouldn't alter our understanding of the Pleistocene landscape. It was very much one thing, and we sort of create a false dichotomy in our own heads, unfortunately, a lot of the time, because it's so very different working on scuba gear than it is standing around in your shorts and a t-shirt in a pit. And so a number of years ago, about 2006 or 7, the park rangers were planting eelgrass, and one of them kept hitting, I'm air quoting here, rocks. And it kept cutting his hand. He kind of got irritated at it. And so he started hand fanning a little ways away. Why can't I just stick this grass into the clay here or the silt and expose the top of the skull of a mastodon? And so it ended up being named for one of them, Jason Vickery. And we got to take a quick look at it in 2008 and basically figured out that there's some very interesting things going on here, that this is a very shallow, buried mastodon that's pretty accessible in an area that you just don't get to go. You're outside of the swimming area at Wakulla. You don't get to go scuba diving out there. So we figure there's a pretty good chance that it's not very disturbed. In spring of 2019, we got to get out there and map the surface area of what bones were exposed. Parts of the skull still there. A number of pieces of vertebrae and other things going back. And we basically, it was a small season. It was January. Even for Florida, it was pretty cold. We had several days where it was actually freezing, but we still dove like troopers and dug just 1 square meter to just test the site and see what we think. Is there strata below it? Is there more of the animal here? And what we found is that it seems to be articulated, that the vertebrae were roughly in order, though spread and moved a little bit. They were all there. There was some rib fragments, and on the dumbest of dumb luck, we dug down into where the layer with the densest concentration of bone was, and took sediment samples 5 centimeters below that, in that sample, or in that roughly 10 centimeter layer, and above it. Sent them off to the lab and said, take a look at these if you would, let me know what you think, and we'll date the best one. Bless their hearts for me being poorly communicative there, and they dated all 3. And boy, are we happy they did. The bottom layer, calibrated years, is 13,500 years old. The top layer is 12,500 years old. And the layer with all the bones is 13,000 years old. It is a bullseye to Clovis time. It appears that animal was covered by sediment in Clovis time, and so is therefore either Clovis or immediately pre-Clovis in age, which is supported for the human occupation by both the Simpson Point, found, like we said, about 400 feet away and uphill slightly. Also, we found 2 fragments of broken bone tools in that layer with those bones. Even they today are probably a little small to be dated directly. We think also that there's a problem of how much organic carbon is preserved, but I think we have a Clovis age or slightly pre-Clovis mastodon sitting there that has not been disturbed since it fell over and passed in a shallow pond environment immediately adjacent to the cave where the Wakulla Spring itself is coming out of. I should say, we think it hasn't moved and that's been completely undisturbed, not because of the lovely condition of the bones and the fact that they're articulated, but because they are surrounded by giant apple snails and other snails and gastropods, monstrous things, some of them 3 inches across, 2 inches high, that are fragile as anything. And when we're exposing them and excavating them, they are in perfect condition. Mastodon can survive some abuse and turbation or movement. The shells, no way. This thing, other than what's exposed at the surface, has never moved, and as near as we can tell, it's right at the time that people are, not just in Florida, but the earliest people we know of so far were at Wakulla Spring.
Could I interject something here about Wakulla again? Basically, I think it's quite possible that mastodon dates to Simpson Point time, which should be early Clovis, if not just pre-Clovis. But what's interesting at Wakulla Springs on land, when we got the Simpson Point on land, right, about 1 meter, 10 centimeters down, artifacts have been found as deep as 0.5 meter even below that. There's still work that could be done at Wakulla on something. It might be multiple components of a longer Paleo-Indian occupation than I know. And the interesting thing about the mastodon, the Vickery mastodon, is that it died in fresh water. That means the water table was up. And we've got places out at Wakulla Springs that are now sort of stranded, that one of the hurricanes blew some trees over in a swampy margin on the opposite side of the river, and the root ball of the tree is just packed with that same sediment. If it dates to the same time, and we don't know the answer to this yet, the water tables may have even been higher. And I think that wet interval happened during when what they call the Allarod, which was prior to the Younger Dryas. And after the Younger Dryas set in, the water tables start dropping out. But anyway, that's another story. But these sites are not only providing cultural information and providing artifact assemblages that you can interpret better because you've got greater organic preservation, but they also provide information about the paleo environment of the time. And that gets me going, because wouldn't it be nice to know when and where water tables were at different times?
It certainly would be. Jason, I know you got another question.
Yeah.
Really quickly, though, Jim, I did want to ask you, are there any diagnostics that have been found in those lower strata that you're talking about?
Sort of like what Jesse found at Page-Ladson, a biface tip, in a number of tools, some bipolar, well, it's not bipolar, I guess it's a cone of force fracturing of rocks, which you seem to find more at a Paleo-Indian time frame, but nothing absolutely diagnostic.
I see.
You always get the tip of the point. You never get the base.
Just the tip.
It identifies what it is. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, certainly do. Well, the mysteries surrounding Wakulla are prominent for sure, and they're going to continue into the future, but we can't wrap the conversation on this location without talking about how some of the bone tool artifacts from this site made their way to Tucson, Arizona, and the story of Stan Olsen. So, Andy, we're going to flip this over to you, and let's talk for a minute about how some of these very unique bone artifacts have made their way clear across the country.
Okay. Oh, that's really funny. And I have a thing that Jim hasn't heard yet. So I was actually an undergrad out in Arizona. I think you mentioned that already. Stan Olsen was retired. I was taking classes from his son, Dr. John Olsen, I think he's retired now too, and doing his own things in Siberia, of all places. And because I was interested in the underwater stuff and the Florida stuff, and, I was an undergrad, I was probably 19 or 20, didn't really realize they had come from Florida, but I was trying to figure out how to get to Florida. So Stan would come in, was incredibly nice to me, and we would talk about Pleistocene camels and some other things. What I didn't realize at the time is why he knew all this stuff was that he had come from working for the Florida Geologic Survey, then Florida State until about 71 or so, and moved to Tucson and the University of Arizona and our beloved Wildcats. He, unfortunately, whatever, how you want to describe it, he had a very extensive teaching collection, shall we say, and it's now part of his his legacy in the laboratory at the Arizona State Museum has a considerable amount of both modern and fossil and some archaeological material. But in the 1959, 58, 61 sort of range, they were collecting a lot of material, a mastodon, some mammoth bones and teeth, and several hundred bone tools out of the front bone room just inside the opening of the cave system at Wakulla. And somehow some of that ended up out in Tucson, and it's still there. There's some of the other faculty today still has a few things on display in one of the other labs, and there's other things sort of tucked away within the collections. And I got to go out and visit, my old stomping grounds and a lot of folks that I still know out there. And they could not have been nicer about letting me see things. And anybody who could think of where anything else that Stan had brought was hidden, they let me see it. And there was material from the original excavations by Sellards in 1917 in Bureau that had made it out there, and a handful of probably about 6 or 8 of the bone tools from the Wakulla cave. But it turns out, thank God he did that, because as far as we can determine at this point, of the hundreds that they reported, it was like 600 or 900 or something, somewhere in between there, they were reported to have come out of the cave. That handful of like 6 or 10 artifacts are the only ones that now today we are positive actually came out of Wakulla cave. So through a circumstance and happenstance, the materials from Wakulla are scattered far and wide beyond belief, including, we know of material being pulled out of Wakulla Springs, bone material, mastodons, as early as the 1830s. A very famous one came out in 1850. And Jim, do you mind if I tell that story real quick?
The 1851, go.
Is this the story of the legend of the lost mammoth? Is that correct?
The lost mastodon, yes.
Mastodon,
I think we've cracked the case.
Okay, yeah, I want to hear all about this.
This is a good one, and this is stranger than fiction. A schmuck in the 1880s wrote a book called Florida for the Tourists, Invalids, and the Mentally Deranged, or something. I don't know. He just made it up. Some of it's legitimate, some of it's real, and some of it he just made up. He got fired before it was done because he was basically pocketing the money that he was supposed to be touring the state and writing this book with, and his editor just finished it off and got the book out. And it was a very popular book and very widely read, and unfortunately very widely cited. And so the story of this mastodon, brought up in 1850, kind of ends right in 1950 until you pick it up again in 1882 when this guy says, and it was on a ship, and it either the stories change and get filtered a little bit, and so it was variously sunk off the west coast of Florida or off Cape Hatteras. But in any case, somewhere out there is supposed to be a ship with a mastodon on it. No, there isn't. There's nothing other. There's no account of that prior to 1882. He just kind of seems to have made it up out of whole cloth because the 1850 mastodon had disappeared. Well, reading newspaper accounts, and the state of Georgia has an unbelievable site that has images that are scannable or just regular JPEGs. But you can scan the text looking for things. And I've gone through as many as I can, page by page, looking for references to Wakulla Springs. And it turns out I have several publications, and they referred to other magazines of the time that I've now found, using archive.org, among other things. That mastodon was loaded up. A newspaper in St. Mark's, Wakulla County, that no longer exists, had an article reprinted in Georgia, in a Georgia newspaper, that said, and it was being loaded up and being shipped to New York. Then 5 years later in a magazine, there is mention of talking about Wakulla Springs and the recovery of that mastodon a few years ago. And it says, if you want to go see it now, you got to go to Barnum's Museum in New York to have a look. That first mastodon that we know of pulled out of Wakulla Springs goes to the circus. And unfortunately, it appears it probably burned when the museum caught on fire in 1868.
Yeah.
And that's why it's lost, and the guy in 1882 has no idea where it is and no idea where the story goes. So somehow that became a story about a shipwreck with Mastodon on it.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't actually find that an awful lot in diligent historical research. And I tell you, Andy, you're speaking my language there, talking about finding old obscure texts on archive.org and using newspaper, websites and newspapers.com and, university libraries and things to be able to peer through time using periodicals. I love that, but, I'd heard the story that you're telling about the so-called missing mastodon, and it just goes to show how well diligent historical research can complement serious archaeology. So kudos to you, sir. It's fantastic research you guys do, and this is something else that I think should be pointed out about history. Diligent historical research, well-informed historians can tell great stories, and that is certainly one of them. I want to thank you both for telling incredible stories tonight and sharing your insights and, of course, your expertise in archaeology with us tonight. And I also want to give you both a moment to please tell people where they can find you online. Mr. Dunbar, perhaps we'll start with you.
You can find me online at the Aucilla Research Institute webpage. And that's the best way to contact me. There's a contact people link there. And I will get that and I can answer.
Perfect. Excellent. And Andy, how can they reach you if they'd like to?
I'm greatly affiliated with the Aucilla Research Institute. For some of my side projects, I have a blog and a webpage called paleo2pioneer.com. On there, I actually have a post about how very important original sources are. You don't got to believe me about anything. I don't want you to believe me about anything. But we'll do our best to help you figure out how to find these things out on your own.
Certainly. We will have all of that information linked on our website as well, so that those of you who are listening, you can get access to their websites and further information about both of these fine gentlemen. And so I want to thank you guys both for being our guests on this podcast for this edition of the Seven Ages Audio Journal. I hope it won't be the last time. Let's do it again.
Appreciate you having us.
Fantastic conversation, and again, thanks to our special guests, Jim Dunbar and Andy Hemmings, who made time to talk to us both at once. One of those rare occasions where a couple of icons in southeastern archaeology were able to provide their insights and lend so much of their knowledge about their experience out there in the field, and of course those earlier than Clovis sites in Florida. And so this is some of the most, in my opinion, cutting-edge archaeology with regard to the Paleoindian era that we are seeing in America right now. It was just a pleasure to talk with both of them.
Yeah, it was a fascinating interview. Both gentlemen joining us at the same time. We don't always get that opportunity, but the Aucilla River and that surrounding area is absolutely fascinating. Some of the most significant archaeology sites in the United States. And plus, all the underwater archaeology that's going on in Florida. I really think that's where the future lies for a lot of the early discoveries for the peopling of America. So again, great to have both of those gentlemen join us. I think that was a fantastic interview and a great way to wrap up 2020 with Seven Ages Audio Journal.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of great stocking stuffers. And all of you guys out there, we sincerely, from the bottom of our hearts, we wish you a happy holidays and send season's greetings from right here in the Crosstime Pub. Now, fellas, on that note, my glass of eggnog is empty. And so I'm going to have to fill this up, and I hope for one more round and some more fine discussion with you guys right here in a moment. But for the public podcast, we now send you guys off, and we will see you again in 2021. On behalf of James Waldo, geologist, Jason Pentrail, environmental scientist and avocationalist archaeologist, and of course your historical enthusiast, Mr. Micah Hanks, we are the Seven Ages Research Associates, and we will see you guys again next year right here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal.